Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to AI for Good. My name is Matthias Greschel. I'm a medical doctor and a current research fellow in bioinformatics at Harvard Department of Biomedical Informatics. And I'll soon join the ITU WHO focus group on AI for Health, in which capacity I'll help put together this webinar series on AI and health. I have the privilege of introducing today's session as part of the AI and Health webinar series, ignoring the Mirage of the Disposable Clinician for the Successful Deployment of AI in Medicine by Professor Kohane, who is the founding chair of Harvard Medical School's Department of Biomedical Informatics. ITU is the United Nations Specialized Agency for Information and Communication Technologies and the organizer of AI for Good. This is organized together with 38 sister United Nations agencies, as well as XPRIZE, ACM, and it's co-convened with Switzerland. Just a couple of housekeeping issues. We're using the Q&A functionality to create an engaging discussion. I know both Zach and our moderator Maha love to have good and critical questions. You can find the Q&A functionality at the bottom of your screen. There's also the chat functionality, which you can use to have discussions with everyone. Please make sure that the message recipient is set to panelists and attendees, and not just to panelists, which you can select just above the message box. And with that, I'd like to give the floor to Professor Maha Farhat, who will be our moderator today. Hi, Maha, how are you doing?
Thank you so much, Matthias. It is my pleasure to moderate this session. My name is Maha Farhat. I'm a pulmonary and critical care physician at Massachusetts General Hospital and a biomedical informatician at Harvard Medical School. My research focus includes the use of machine learning to predict antibiotic resistance in tuberculosis, and hence I know firsthand the power and perils of AI on the clinical care process. We are extremely lucky to have Dr. Zach Kohane speaking today. Dr. Kohane is the Marion V. Nelson Professor and founding chair of biomedical informatics at Harvard Medical School. Over the last 30 years, Dr. Kohane's research agenda has been driven by the vision of what biomedical researchers could do to find new cures, provide new diagnoses, and deliver the best care available if data could be converted more rapidly to knowledge, and in turn, knowledge to practice. In so doing, Dr. Kohane has designed and led multiple internationally adopted efforts to instrument the healthcare enterprise for discovery and to enable innovative decision-making tools to be applied to the point of care. At the same time, the new insights afforded by omics-scale molecular analyses have inspired him and his collaborators to work on recharacterizing and reclassifying diseases such as autism, rheumatoid arthritis, and cancers. In many of these studies, the developmental trajectories of thousands of genes have been a powerful tool in unraveling complex diseases. Dr. Kohane currently leads 3 large NIH-funded projects that cut across the entire agenda, including a Center for Excellence in Genomic Science that focuses on neuropsychiatric disease, the Coordinating Center for the Undiagnosed Diseases Network, and the Harvard Center for Excellence in Big Data to Knowledge. Beyond his many research accolades, Dr. Kohane is a highly respected educator and an awarded mentor who has trained multiple US and international leaders in biomedical informatics. It's really hard to do his accomplishments justice in the short time we have. Dr. Kohane, I turn it over to you. We are looking forward to your talk.
Thank you, Maha. That's probably the nicest introduction I've ever received, so thank you very much for that. I ask you for your indulgence as I share my screen. Let's see, desktop 1, there we go. Do you see a nice white screen?
Yes.
All right, good. So welcome, everybody. It's my pleasure to discuss the topic that we have settled today on, which is keeping the doctor in the loop for machine learning. Just to remind ourselves of the small world, shown here on this first slide is a view out of my apartment in Geneva, where I grew up. And you see not only the Mont Blanc in the background and the Salève in the foreground, but you also see the International Telecommunications Union building right there, which I used to see every day growing up, and I still see when growing up. So there we have it, very small world. And I look forward to meeting many of you in the near future. And the WHO, by the way, is on the left, but outside the frame. So I need to just share with you some disclosures. I'm the board member of several companies. I'm on the scientific advisory board of several other companies, but I think the conflict of interest that is the greatest and that is often understated, is not sufficiently stated, is that I am passionately biased towards findings and hypotheses that I believe are sound, and at least until they're proven unsound. And that is, I think, my biggest bias, and feel free to call me on it. And for that matter, I only have, I think, 26 more slides, so we have plenty of time. So I'm not going to look at the Q&A or chat window, but if there's questions, I'm going to ask Maha to look at it and interrupt me. Thank you very much. So I think it's important to talk about what the hell is this machine learning task that we're talking about. And I'm going to share with you here this diagram that we published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, where we highlighted what we call the machine learning spectrum. Shown here on the x-axis is data sample size, going from 1 to 10 to the 10. And on the y-axis, the relative human to machine decision-making effort. So that at the top, it's mostly the machine that's developing the computational models, and at the bottom, it's mostly human. And in that span from human knowledge to pure ML, and from 1 to 10 to the 10 data items, where do we find classical decision-making, medical decision-making? We find it here in this red box, where we find, for example, risk calculators, such as the Framingham Heart Risk Calculator that calculates just on a handful of parameters your risk of death or having a cardiac event. And notice that although there is some machine learning tools there used like logistic regression, it's a human who's really picked the parameters. And that is in contradistinction to the deep learning zone, where you've heard about a lot of these neural network-based deep learning algorithms. And there, not only is the data used to drive the parameters of the model, but the doctor, researcher does not even pick the variables. The system picks and weights the important variables across all the possible variables effectively. And so from that perspective, machine learning has been around for a long time. It's become more interesting and more powerful as we go from the bottom left of our diagram to the top right. And given the fact that we're showing the human getting smaller and smaller, is it the case that humans have less and less a role to play? And that might have indeed been the conclusion early on in the machine learning literature, because if you see this publication that also appeared in JAMA, this was a groundbreaking publication in 2016. I happen to have written a editorial about it, but what was amazing about it is that these researchers at Google built a neural network to detect and classify diabetic retinopathy based on these images that had been annotated as to whether what kind of retinopathy it was and the degree of retinopathy. And they did surprisingly well. In fact, on average, better than an expert ophthalmologist in getting to the consensus of a panel of expert ophthalmologists. And what was remarkable is the major contribution of doctors to this whole effort was not constructing the experiment or running the experiment. It was simply just adding labels. And from that perspective, a lot of people, including some of the leaders of machine learning, had said maybe the era of doctors, particularly for image-based modalities like dermatology, radiology, ophthalmology, pathology, were going to play a much more minor role. Then there was a pushback because initially a lot of doctors were alarmed, and the medical establishment is large and powerful. And so these machine learning experts said, well, no, we're all going to get along. Doctors have a role to play. But initially, that was a bit of a palliation, get along kind of comment. The point I'm going to make through the rest of our discussion here is not only are doctors nice to have or pleasant to have as part of this machine learning performance, but we will fail rapidly and fail our patients and make major errors if we do not include doctors very closely in the process. Just to make something, to make it very clear, how we have to understand how medicine changes from time to time, from place to place. Epic, a manufacturer of electronic health records, had on its website an algorithm which had developed using hospitals' data, hospitals that they themselves provide the electronic health record systems. And because they have a privileged relationship between them, the electronic health record vendor, and the leadership of these hospitals, they were able to get the data from all these hospitals and come up with a predictor of deterioration of patients. Very helpful when you're especially at low resource availability, as was the case in maybe April 2020 in Massachusetts and New York, and unfortunately in March 2021 in India, for example, or April 2021 in India. But colleagues at University of Michigan showed that when you actually use this program at hospitals other than where it had originally been trained against their data, and if you see on the x-axis predicted probability and then the actual observed risk of deterioration, it performed very, very poorly. And furthermore, if you looked at how this performed in May 2020 versus August 2020, performance of the algorithm dropped off dramatically because, as a doctor would know, the presentation of the patients are different, the case mix is different, the medications available are different. And so if you had, God forbid, made incredibly important triage decisions on that algorithm without understanding the dynamics, both of the healthcare system in terms of how it changes with location and practice, but also how it changes over time, you would have been making major errors in your triage decision. And that's only one small example of how not understanding the healthcare system and not involving the doctor in the process is important. This reminds me of a study I did with one of my colleagues, Griffin Weber. That's actually inaccurate. Griffin did the study, I was a hanger-on. But what he did was the following. But first, let me contextualize it. I was visited by a machine learning expert, a CEO of a machine learning company from Silicon Valley, who was visiting Boston because he was selling and had successfully sold his machine learning predictive algorithms to one of our local insurance companies in the Massachusetts area. And he asked me, he had dropped by my office to see what was new. And so I shared with him this slide, and I said, these were statistics developed across millions of patients across two of our largest hospitals. Could you explain to me why, if you're like me, white, male, and 50 to 69 years old, if you have a low white blood count between 12 a.m. and 8 a.m., your chance of death in the next 3 years is greater than 56%. Whereas if you're, again, white and male like I am, between age of 50 and 69, your chance of death between 8 a.m. and 4 p.m. is less than 3%. And he thought about it. He said circadian rhythm, and I said not close. And I'll just stop for 5 seconds for the audience to think, what was in fact the cause of this huge disparity? And the answer is that if you are getting your blood drawn at 3 o'clock in the morning, that tells us that you're in the hospital and you're doing very poorly. You might be dying. And therefore, a doctor has decided to insert a needle into your arm to draw blood. And so the difference between the predictive value is really the time of night which also tells us what the doctor is thinking. So you're actually crowdsourcing what the doctor is thinking. But unfortunately, the Silicon Valley company, like many other companies, knew nothing of what the doctor was thinking. And for them, this difference did not correspond to anything but noise. But it's not noise, it's not randomly distributed, it's very biased. And there's an opportunity to do more with it. So let me be very concrete. There's these two physiologies that we're measuring. We're measuring the physiology of the patient, and we're measuring the physiology of the healthcare system, or in plain English, the behavior of doctors in response to patients. So when we looked at all the tests, over hundreds of tests, for 63% of them, if you look here at the odds ratio, it protects you, but it makes you more likely to die. And this is how much additional information is provided by the test. For 63% of the tests, just knowing that the test was ordered was just as important, if not more, than the result of the test. Think about it, just the fact that the test was ordered. Now, of course, if you use both the value of the test as well as the what we call health system dynamics, the doctor deciding to do the test, then you have even better predictability. But the point here is to ignore the action of the doctor, the ordering of the test, is to actually miss a lot of the signal that is buried in the electronic health record and to misunderstand it. Another way to think about it is this. If you are evaluating a patient and you're a medical student and you're standing next to a well-trained senior doctor like Dr. Farhat, and this patient is being evaluated because they have shortness of breath, if Dr. Maha Farhat orders a D-dimer, a measure of coagulopathy, I start thinking, maybe they're thinking about, maybe Dr. Farhat is thinking about pulmonary embolus. And then when she orders a chest x-ray, I say, maybe she is thinking about pulmonary embolus. And then when she orders a chest CT, I said, she's not thinking about a heart attack, she's thinking about pulmonary embolus. And so my point is, I am, as a junior medical student, I don't know very much about the patient. But because Dr. Farhat is, because I know in theory a lot about medicine, but not in practice, I'm able to use Dr. Maha Farhat's decisions as a way to drive my diagnostic inference. But I actually don't know anything. I know very little. And so this is work done by these two colleagues of mine, shown up here on the right, Dr. Bolio-Jones and William here, one of my postdocs. And the point that we made is that this is exactly what machine learning does. Machine learning is to the doctor the way the medical student who knows little is to the senior clinician. And we published this recently in Nature Communications. And here's how we demonstrated it. If you look at what's happening in care, you see that there is patient physiology, which affects the physician's belief about what's going on, which affects the physician's actions, which then affect the patient's physiology. And these are measured in several ways. You can see the patient physiology through routine telemetry. You can see the physician's belief by what they're writing in their clinical notes. And you can see their actions, both in the EMR, in the electronic medical record, but also simply in the charge details. What are the charge details? Those are the actions that are sent to the payer as things that the doctor did so we can get reimbursed. And so when we did an analysis looking about the informativeness across multiple diseases, when we compared it to a study that Google had done using the electronic health record, the full electronic health record, we found that just using the charges, so this is not any of the doctor notes, just the charges, gave you an area under the receiving operating characteristic curve, so a measure of accuracy that was not much inferior for predictions of mortality, predictions of readmissions, and predictions of length of stay. Because just by tagging onto what the doctor was doing, the machine learning algorithm was getting its cue. And that's very important because it tells us that if we were to then unleash these algorithms without an expert doctor, let's say with a medical student or a paraprofessional without much experience, the performance would be much, much worse because the machine learning algorithm, like the medical student without a Dr. Farhat to look at, would not really know what's going on. This is also shown by the fact that when you tell the program what disease you're looking for, like if you're looking for mortality or if you're looking for length of stay, it does much, much better than if you're saying, I'm looking for predictions across all these possibilities. So this whole aspect of focusing on what's going on with the patient is something that is not well captured by the machine learning algorithms of the present. By the way, I hope I'm doing okay for time. I see that I have 10 minutes. If that's not the case, someone speak up. So other kinds of problems that we need humans to get involved in. Most machine learning studies these days look like this. You have a study sample, let's say patients with heart attacks, and you have controls, patients without heart attacks who are matched, let's say, for age and sex. And then you look back a certain amount of time, let's say 3 years, and you say, can I look at these patients who eventually become cases and these patients who eventually became controls and see if I can come up with what are the characteristics using machine learning that predict whether you're going to be a case or control, whether you're going to have a heart attack or not. And this common study design, which is used also a lot in epidemiology and is also used in non-clinical machine learning, like to predict time to disk drive failure. The implicit assumption there is that there's a transition from the non-disease state to the disease state that is instantaneous, because we're only measuring here and here. We're measuring at the end and we're measuring X time in the past. But in fact, what's happening, what happens in a cohort study or what's happening clinically is we're measuring several points along the trajectory. But that's not well captured in these EHR studies when we're going back in time and to a certain time point. And this has quite significant implications. This is a famous study about a lipoprotein A, where they did exactly that study to predict heart attack or myocardial infarction, but they assumed essentially an instantaneous transition from the healthy state to the unhealthy state. And what we were able to show is, depending on whether you assumed a linear trajectory from healthy to unhealthy, or a logistic or logarithmic scale, you could get anywhere from 1/8 to 1/2 of the estimated effect of the lipoprotein A in this study. And yet, so in other words, a much, much smaller effect than predicted because of this temporal bias that if you were watching the patient as a clinician, you would not be fooled by. And the right way, by the way, to adjust for that problem is, in fact, to find patients where you can simulate a prospective deployment or measurement by finding samples all the way through their trajectory from the past to the present. Quickly want to change my focus on the fact that we are poor leaders in the machine learning community. Here is a study that was done by Ben Rice, shown in the top right. And this is a single patient for which the discharge diagnoses from the emergency room are summarized here across time. This is across time. These are the ICD codes that have been aggregated into these categories. And you see here, this patient has a lot of GI issues and a lot of injury issues. I'd like you to reflect for 2 seconds. What is the diagnosis of this patient? Well, the diagnosis is domestic abuse. And Ben Rice published in 2009 a paper in the British Medical Journal using 100,000 visits from emergency rooms in Massachusetts, showing that we could diagnose on average 2 years before the patient was suspected to have domestic abuse by the healthcare system, up to, on average, 2 years before the healthcare system was aware, and up to 6. And we published this in 2009. Has anybody, and this was not a tiny signal like you see in some genetics studies, big odds ratios, has this been deployed anywhere? No. And yet, it's a clear and present healthcare risk. And I can only say that I blame myself, and I also ask why our leadership in the healthcare systems, nationally, internationally, not taking big signals like this, of which this is only one example, and using our leadership as doctors and healthcare leaders to make a difference. Unfortunately, where healthcare technology, healthcare information technology has made the biggest difference is in the negative. So that as a tool Gowanda wrote in the Annals of Medicine, we have actually done a lot with technology to make the practice of medicine less personal, more bureaucratic, more focused on data entry, and less on patient interaction and on bringing out the important features that we need for medical decision making. And it doesn't have to be so. In an article that I wrote in the New England Journal of Medicine with Alvin Rajkumar and Jeff Dean from Google AI, we said that one of the important applications would be to use the computer essentially as a very informed medical scribe, so that an audio recording and video recording of a conversation between a doctor and patient would result in sections of a clinical note that corresponds to the conversation with the correct billing codes, and automated generation of sections of a clinical note, automatic assignments of the billing codes, but also summary of the plan shared with the patients. And the doctor would be looking at the patient rather than looking at the computer as they're typing data in. And I do think that is an important focus. I just want to stop right now for a second. Maha, how much time do I have left?
So Zach, you can go for another 10 minutes if you'd like.
Excellent. Thank
Yes.
you. Thank you. Great. Okay. Perhaps one of the most puzzling and yet enticing views of artificial intelligence in medicine was inspired by the news back in 2016 of AlphaGo, which then got generalized to AlphaZero. What did AlphaGo do? It was, if you look at our machine learning spectrum in that article that I showed you earlier, it was all the way at the top of the deep learning spectrum because it required no human interaction. Because what happened in AlphaGo, you had reinforcement learning where the machine played against itself millions and millions of times and figured out which were the best moves throughout the game to beat itself. And in so doing, it not only recreated all the known moves of the masters in Go, but then went on to develop new strategies that had never been discovered and became the champion. And in Go, as you see in this picture, the program soundly defeated the world's best Go player. And they generalized AlphaGo to AlphaZero, and it did the same thing, for example, for chess, which had previously been done in a more detailed human-driven fashion, but this was chess being done by playing itself in this reinforcement learning mode. And so the question immediately posed itself, why is this not going to be the case in medicine? Why can't we just view the treatment of a patient as this game so that using reinforcement learning, we can quickly find the optimal path to treating patients in ways that we could not imagine? Well, fortunately, we have insightful people in the machine learning community, like this individual, Andrej Karpathy. I want to point out that Andrej Karpathy is the head of artificial intelligence machine learning for Tesla. And in Latin, we have this phrase, nomen est omen. Your name is your destiny. And his is certainly true because Karpathy, he automatically allows cars to find their path. Be that as may, he articulated where reinforcement learning was effective, in systems like Go and chess, where the system is deterministic, where it's fully observed, where the action space is discrete, it's not probabilistic, it's not continuous rather, where we have a perfect simulator of the system that we're working on, like Go. And each episode or game is relatively short. Evaluation is clear, fast, and allows a lot of trial and error experience. And there's huge data sets of human play, all true for Go and chess. But that is not true for physiology of the rest of medicine. Physiology is not deterministic. It's not fully observed. There's lots of hidden variables. It's not discrete. It's continuous. We don't have a perfect simulator. The episodes games are not relatively short. It's not clear what is a winning move at any given point in our treatment. And there are not huge data sets of physician performance. That's changing, but still, compared to the data sets that we have for chess, for example, tiny. And so for all these medical applications, this notion of just the computer playing itself is nonsensical, except for one area of medicine where those positive rules that Andrej Karpathy articulated on the left do apply. Can you think of where in medicine we have these characteristics? Sadly, it's in the game of reimbursement. How, whether it's your country or your insurer, pays for healthcare. And because there in healthcare, the rules of reimbursement are very clear. They're written in black and white. And both the payer and the healthcare system can then use reinforcement learning to actually figure out how to maximize or minimize reimbursement. I can tell you there's many companies going just after that. You can also figure out how to maximize or minimize use of the healthcare resources, and also when to approve a referral, because again, there are very discrete criteria that are in black and white that can be that's machinable, that can be played at a game. Unfortunately, that is much easier than the light side of this medical game, where deciding what's the best decision for the patient and what's the right decision that the doctor should advise upon, those are much harder because of all the limitations that we just discussed. So in the short term, we're going to see, unfortunately, far more success on the left than on the right. Another reason that we need to get involved, keep doctors involved in healthcare, is because the game of fraud, or let's say inaccurate billing, is extensively going to be played. In this article that we published in Science, shown here is a actual picture of a benign melanocytic nevus, and a machine learning program that has been trained on this shows that it is benign. It does a very good job of doing that. But if you understand the algorithm, you can add a bunch of noise that makes the picture look indistinguishable to a human being. So this looks like pretty much the same picture. But to the algorithm, this noise, this is in fact this, because it's not noise, it's this additional signal that looks random but is not, makes the machine learning algorithm think that you actually have a malignancy there. And there are multiple, we showed in this article, multiple ways to trivially trick the machine learning program. But unfortunately, that's not this adversarial attack on the decision or the classification of patient is not new. There are, in fact, in the basement of many hospitals, certainly in the United States and maybe around the world, teams of individuals whose only job is to reclassify a patient to maximize billing. And so if we want to have a learning healthcare system, we as doctors have to start asserting our leadership about what are, in fact, the drivers of how we classify patients, so that it's not the dollar. It's going to be a very hard thing to change because there's huge economic incentives. But if we want our data to accurately reflect what we see, then we have to assert our leadership. Okay. In closing, I just want you to look at this. What is this weird signal? Well, this weird signal, turns out, is the weight from a scale that I had installed in the apartment of my late mother, who several years ago, living independently, had been admitted twice within 3 months for heart failure. And the reason she was admitted was just to give her intravenous Lasix to diurese, to remove the water in her body so that she could walk around. And she had these large swollen legs. And it was very clear to me that if we weren't going to do something different, she was going to die, because after the second admission in 3 months, she was extremely weak and had to go to rehabilitation. And she already had a concierge doctor that was paying lots of money for. She was getting the best healthcare could deliver. So I did something that I knew had been shown not to work in a randomized controlled trial, which is to use a scale to actually advise my mother whether to take an additional dose of Lasix, the oral version of that diuretic. And so every morning I would call up my mother, and I'd say, I would call up my mother when I would see that her weight had gone up by a pound or two, and say, why don't you take an extra dose of Lasix? And I did that for years. And not only did it keep her out of the hospital, but her life changed because her legs no longer looked like tree trunks, but had shrunk back to normal legs. And so I asked myself, why had I succeeded where all the randomized controlled trials for this kind of intervention had not succeeded? And here are my answers. And I think we have to think about that when we think about doctor in the loop. Who completes the loop? I was calling her up. My mother was a tough lady and appropriately suspicious. And if it had not been someone she had trusted a lot, she might not have been compliant with either going on the scale or taking the pill. Who talks to the rest of the healthcare system? So I'm a doctor, but I have a PhD in computer science, but I'm trained as a pediatric endocrinologist. And so I could call the rest of the doctors' healthcare system and tell them what I was doing and keep them updated. But who would do that normally? Who oversees what's going on? Who provides process automation? In other words, who integrates all this data? I was doing this, online, but in a very artisanal way. Who would actually integrate this into the electronic health record and make sure someone's looking at it every day? And so the other big difference was I was looking at it every day. Many of the trials, because it's expensive to have someone looking at this, many of the trials would do it once or twice a week. And this is obviously a trivial algorithm, but there's always another condition that you're not considering. And so when I was looking for a while at my mother's weight and I saw it going down, I said to myself, wow, I'm doing even better than I used to be doing. I'm getting her weight tighter. And what was happening though, I was being a doctor like all other doctors. I was not listening to my patient, because what she had actually told me, and I'd sort of pushed it aside as just old person stuff, was that she was getting up at night to urinate. And what was happening is she was developing type 2 diabetes. And so what I did is I immediately put her on metformin, her weight stabilized, stopped going to the bathroom, and she was fine. But the point is, the algorithm was simple until some other thing happened, and there's thousands of other things that can happen. So it's not that simple. You have to have a doctor in the loop. So I'm just going to stop there in the interest of time and just say this area of where computing, medicine, and artificial intelligence meet is absolutely the next frontier for us to be able to scale up in medicine. I just flew by 2 slides about what we could have done and what was not done with regard to COVID and our public health support using the right kind of data. But we're having this symposium that I invite you to look at SAIL.health, where we're going to discuss many of these issues. I'll stop there. If there's any questions, fine. If not, I'll bid you adieu.
Thank you so much, Zach. That was really wonderful. I have to say, it's really, as a physician also who works on AI, it was incredible to see you kind of peel away the complexity of the layers between the computer and the doctor, and to kind of really portray how complex this whole process is, but at the same time giving us hope for specific examples when there could be a lot of innovation. So there are actually 2 questions that are from the audience that I will go ahead and start with. So Heidi Siebold, thank you for your question. So you're asking, I wonder if all the examples you have talked about so far can be summarized under garbage in, garbage out. This was given early in your talk. If the data is not clearly created and are actually useful for the question at hand, of course, the ML algorithm will not be able to do reasonable predictions, right? So are you arguing that doctors should have the role of checking the data for soundness for a given task?
That's a great question, and it's a frequent question. And of course, yes, who would not want to have better data? But the fact is, I don't think that's where the problem is, and I don't think that's where the solution is. The data, we are going to get more data. We're going to get more data, outpatient data through wearables and so on. But the data that we're going to get in the near future is pretty much the data that doctors make decisions on every day. And I think what's going to happen is that we have to get smarter. Our programs have to get smarter in dealing with the noise, in dealing with the incompleteness, the missingness, because indeed, very good doctors perform at heroically expert levels with these kind of data, understanding the data. And so I think that the impulse to improve data is a recurring one, because there certainly is a lot of garbage. But I'm telling you that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, like the example of domestic abuse, but there's lots and lots of other things that are trivial mistakes that are made all the time that we could intercept. But we can actually make our programs much more intelligent, much more, the goal is like a doctor who understands the incompleteness, the bias, and yet is able to deliver high quality care. I think if we go in demanding perfect health data, we are actually condemning ourselves to the clericalization of doctors, and more importantly, focusing on the wrong thing. It's a longer discussion, but it's a great question.
Thank you, Zach. If I may follow up on that, perhaps we do have one more question from the audience, but maybe to follow up on Heidi's question. Do you think, can you imagine there being a role for the computer in helping collect or label, patient data?
Absolutely right. And so I do think that a lot of important findings are just mentioned by the doctor, never written down. We can capture that through voice recognition, natural language processing. There's a lot of things that video. Fei Li from Stanford has this amazing video where this is a very restricted application, but you can imagine a larger application. It's cameras in the ceiling, and she's watching doctors in the ICU. And all doctors are supposed to wash their hands before they examine patient. And she's able to see those doctors and tag automatically those doctors that did not wash their hands, and then who else they touched before they saw the patients. So you can see exactly the spread of these things. So I do think that, and it gets uncomfortably close to Big Brother, but there is a whole bunch of ways that we can label the encounter, the patient at home, the patient in the hospital, in ways that are going to be more comprehensive, more complete, in ways that we could not imagine. Again, liberating us from our role as note takers and more engaged as problem solvers emotional supports, joint decision makers, which I think is both the more fun part and frankly, the harder part. Common sense is something that's hard to teach computers. Completeness, compulsivity is something they do well.
That's wonderful, Zach. And I think this would be welcome to the ears of doctors to actually thinking about how AI can actually support them rather than replace them. So we have a question from Frederick Werner. What do you think about smartwatches using ML to diagnose heart conditions or emotional states?
So I think the short answer is it's undoubtedly going to happen. Now, the problem is we're going to have growing pains in the sense that every one of these things is also a business sometimes and therefore requires early results. And so, for example, in the New England Journal of Medicine, we published this study about the Apple smartwatch and atrial fibrillation. Now, it turns out it did detect it, but there's also a huge amount of false positives. And so eventually, when you're going to have integration both of symptomatology and other modalities, I think we're going to do a lot better. And so this, like many other technologies, is going to deliver less than expected in the short term and more than expected in the long term. So I think in the longer term, there's no question 99.9% of our lives are outside hospitals. So the opportunity to diagnose movement disorders, neurological deterioration, heart disease, all those things will be much more an outpatient monitoring kind of thing that just happens automatically and not episodically, often after the fact in the hospital. So I'm very optimistic about the use of those, but in the short term, the trade-off between sensitivity and specificity is not ideal. And part of it is, by the way, the big divide between healthcare data in the healthcare system and data outside in the patient world. For example, if that smartwatch knew about your previous angiogram or EKG, it might be able to change its priors or what it's seeing on the ECG. But the two data sets are completely separate. So if I were to tell one of the big challenges of the future is joining those two data sets. It's not a technical challenge, it's a sociological challenge. And it's a deep one because, for example, most doctors don't want to get a pile of ECGs from days and days out there, or, for example, your Twitter feed, which is also, by the way, very diagnostic. But we're not trained, we don't have the infrastructure to allow us to digest those external sources of data in a way that is respectful of and convenient for the workflow that clinicians currently have.
Fantastic, Zach. So we have a question from Michael Strange, Malmo University. So he's saying, thank you. We have a project in Scania, Sweden, trying to build understanding of AI in health among local government actors, civil society, business, and academia to better design rollout of technology to ensure already marginalized groups aren't left out. Are you aware of similar initiatives in your work?
Yes. So there are actually several efforts. There are several efforts addressing issues of marginalized individuals. And individuals are marginalized in a number of ways. A, they may not have access to the technology. So they may not have the watch or the smartphone. They may belong to subgroups that are poorly represented in the data. And so therefore they are inadequately diagnosed or prognosticated against. And so there are efforts at the Food and Drug Administration to study this. There are efforts in our Consumer Protection Agency in the United States to study this. And all the big data companies have research groups. I don't say that they are translating necessarily that research into practice, but all the big data companies like Amazon and Microsoft have major research groups trying to understand that. But there's no question that right now, like many advances, unfortunately, the haves will be better off than the have-nots. Nonetheless, like in many other contexts, technology may allow some leapfrogging to happen. So for example, we were terrible in the United States on monitoring the patient flow and their morbidity in COVID. So India, as you know, is going through a terrible part of the pandemic. And what they did is they instrumented a WhatsApp app to actually allow people using WhatsApp to report in the hospital the findings of the patient. So they could have over large areas in India monitoring of where there was no oxygen, where supplies, where there was intubation, and so on. It was not complete, but the fact is they were able to leapfrog past our very clunky electronic health record systems to something that was much more versatile. Now, they also are missing some very important infrastructure, but I guess my point is that if we're clever and opportunistic, I think there's ways to accelerate the arrival of some of these newer technologies like machine learning to communities that have been historically underserved, because in some ways we don't have a lot of the old school infrastructure that sometimes gets in the way. Legal liability. I just saw legal liability. Eventually, so this is not, I'm speaking from the United States. I grew up in Switzerland. In Switzerland, legal liability for doctors, not a big issue. Doctors were respected, and people were kind of meek when things went south. In the United States, I am sure there are scores of legal law firms which are waiting for the first great mistake by a machine learning company that will allow them to, well, both ways. By a machine learning company that will allow them to do a class action lawsuit against the machine learning company, and conversely, a case in a hospital that had machine learning that was missed because the doctor did not use the machine learning. And so I think it's going to cut both ways. And so this will be a rapidly developing area of case law. People who get sued for not using these systems when enough of these systems are being used, and those systems that are going to be sued because they were carelessly implemented, sort of like the EPIC system I just showed you for deterioration. What happened is in Michigan, they actually literally turned off the system because it was giving these annoying stratifications of patients that was getting in the way of care. I could see a version of that leading to a lawsuit.
Thank you, Zach. We're going to take one last question. This is from Herdiantri Sufriana. So if we can provide a framework for a doctor to criticize each prediction case by case using the model internal properties, will it help? In the same fashion like ordering a lab test, but it's for AI prognostication.
I think that is a wonderful idea. That in National Institutes of Health would be a successful grant, is getting such a framework to actually allow doctors critique. And you become immediately a hero to the FDA. That's the framework we need. That is the framework we need, because how else are we going to decide what's right? And in fact, this is a big topic of this conference that we're having in Bermuda, where, sorry for the advertisement, we have the editors from the New England Journal, from Lancet, and from Nature discussing it. And what is the standards of proof for performance of these algorithms? And the framework that you're hinting at is exactly what we need.
Thank you so much, Zach. I want to thank you for this really wonderful talk and a really excellent discussion. Thank you to the audience for your attention and your fantastic questions. I believe I answered all of them or got them to Dr. Kohane's attention. I'm going to turn it over to Matthias for some final announcements before adjourning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maha, and also thank you, Zach, for this wonderful talk. We're curious to see if you, all the participants, would be interested in recommending AI for Good. So we're going to launch a quick poll that'll now appear on your screen. And please type in your answer how likely you recommend the seminar and the webinar series that we're now going to organize over the next year about AI in health. In the meantime, a few announcements about upcoming sessions. Tomorrow there's going to be a session on AI in the Middle East and North Africa, visions and realities. On Thursday, we have Trustworthy AI with Himabindu Lakaraju. You can find more information and the links in the chat. And you can also just Google or type in the URL for AI for Good, which is aiforgood.itu.int. With that, we've reached the end of the session. Thanks for joining, be it via Zoom or a live stream. Thanks again to Maha and Zach for moderating and speaking today. And we'd like to thank a final thank you to also the participants, partner sponsors, and the co-convener Switzerland. Hope to see you all on Wednesday. Have a great rest of the day. Goodbye.
Rewind selector. Rewind selector. Rewind selector. Rewind selector. Rewind selector. Rewind selector.